Hello. In this video clip, I'd like us to explore some of the research that we know about deaf children and working with interpreters. This is based on a Canadian study that I've conducted, and I'll blend it with some of the other research that's known about mediated instruction. Let me start on this clip with an understanding of 4 questions that should guide us when we're thinking about, is this education appropriate for a student? The first question that I think should guide all of our curriculum decisions, and then again all of our placement decisions, is what educational purposes are we seeking to attain for this particular student? And what educational experiences will then help that student attain those experiences? In the last clip, I talked a little bit about some of the student readiness factors, and I think those are key again when we think about that particular question. Then the third question is, how do we organize the educational experiences for the student, and how do we determine whether the purposes are being attained? So I'd like you to keep those 4 questions in mind, because those are 4 questions that we would ask for any student, whether they be deaf, hard of hearing, or not deaf. And they should be the same questions and expectations that we have for working with a deaf student. One of the things that happens, though, and I think I alluded to this in the previous video clip, is that there can be an official curriculum and then a real curriculum that happens for many of our learners. And one of the things that we know from the evidence is that for many children who are in inclusive settings, who are deaf, is that the gap widens between what is the official curriculum and what the deaf student actually experiences the more they move through the grade levels. So what I'm saying is that the research tells us to be cautious then about making sure that the child is ready for an inclusive education, because that widening academic development, that gap, is a serious one for deaf students. The other piece that I think is a really important thing to consider when you're planning your curriculum and the design of the deaf education for that student is, where does the deaf student see themselves reflected in that curriculum? For all of us, I think that we want to be part of an inclusive environment where we see ourselves as a competent student, and so there has to be opportunities for a bit of deaf studies within that curriculum. One of the schools that I'm working with right now are just thinking about some transition and career guidance. And one of the things that's helpful when we're thinking about career guidance and giving students ideas about the wonderful things that could await them once they're done school is to have lots of different role models that they're exposed to. And so for you as a hearing student, or a hearing teacher, excuse me, do you know that there happen to be deaf medical students in Canada now studying to be family physicians? I think it's wonderful for a student in a rural environment for them to aspire to become a family physician as a deaf person. Do you know that there are engineers? Do you know that there are deaf lawyers? Do you know that there are deaf nurses? And so exposing the child to all kinds of deaf role models can be a piece of a deaf studies curriculum. There's also a large history of deaf history, deaf learning, deaf success stories around the world that I think is a significant birthright of many deaf children. And it can be a challenging piece for hearing teachers to get into the curriculum, but with some consultants, I think it can be. So the piece that I want you to take away from what I've said in this first few minutes is that the gap widens the more the student is in an inclusive environment, that transition planning is a key piece for all students. So whether they're in the K to grade 3, grade 4 to grade 6, grade 7 to 9, high school, that we constantly want to be watching for those 4 questions that I gave you at the beginning of this clip and finding out whether the environment still meets the child's needs. One of the other aspects of curriculum that you'll see on the PowerPoint is the nature of hidden curriculum. And those are some of the concepts that result as our interactions and our beliefs, our expectations for students come on to those students. Let me give you an example. One of the schools I was in recently has a lovely, competent deaf student who is a very fluent user of sign language and who can also use their voice. And so when I was visiting in the classroom, the teacher said to the student, "Oh, don't use your sign language, just give your presentation in spoken English today. Your voice is so beautiful." What we would encourage the teacher to think about is that that places a value on speech, more than the sign language. It should be up to the child to give the presentation in whatever language form they choose to. And so it's a hidden value that's given to the student through the messages of use your speech is better, don't use your sign language, that's not as good. And so all of those cultural beliefs can frame what we call autism, or the belief that it's better to hear and speak than it is to use a signed language. And so we constantly want to be vigilant, I think, as teachers working with deaf students, to make sure that inadvertently we're not giving students messages that would perhaps give them a message that they're less than competent or that their languages are less than valued. I said in the first clip that you may have watched is that often our parents have no experience parenting a deaf child. For many, 90% of the deaf children born today will be born to parents who are also hearing, who have no experience or no exposure. It's often the first deaf child in the family. And they may experience the professional community who have a variety of opinions about how best to serve a deaf student. Those variety of opinions often come from a professional perspective that may not be formed on having any interaction with an adult who is deaf. The distinction I'm drawing here is that if you haven't met deaf adults, you may not have any idea what a deaf life can look like. So just as I said earlier that we have deaf people studying medicine today, if you are unfamiliar with deaf adults and you haven't met very many, then it can be really challenging, I think, for hearing teachers and for school districts to get a handle on what does it mean to bring an educational experience to bear that creates a very positive deaf life for the student. And the other piece that's really significant is to be able to look at the day-to-day communication that happens in the classroom for the deaf student and for the family. And again, what we know from the research is that there's a real language mismatch for deaf students. And so often they come to schools where they're the only deaf student. They have some interaction with somebody who can sign. That may be a qualified interpreter, it might not be. They may have some limited interaction with other students through the gestures or a little bit of finger spelling or a little bit of texting, maybe mediated through the interpreter. But it's not typical of the kind of interaction that other deaf students have with their teachers or with other hearing students have with their teachers. It's not typical of the interaction that hearing students have with other hearing students either. Then when they go home, they may also have a language impoverished experience. And what I mean by that is that their parents may not be fluent in sign language, their siblings may not be fluent in sign language. And so when they go home, there isn't an active language environment that would be typical of a hearing student who can go home and talk in English, same language, with their hearing parents, or by contrast, a deaf student who's being raised by deaf parents, where they go home and they share the same language and can talk about absolutely anything. So the fact that there's a language mismatch also then contributes to those linguistic opportunities that are then reduced for the students. And that has an impact then on how they actively construct knowledge. And we certainly know that through the research. When you look at the PowerPoint, the references will be available to you so that you can go back and look at that if you're interested. The last thing that I'd like to say before I give you the results of the study that I conducted is that for all of us, again, in this inclusive conversation, we need to be thinking about student engagement. And for all of our students, we know that they engage at 3 different levels, whether that's social engagement, where we feel like we can belong in the school, that we have a way to participate actively. Academic engagement, which is being able to manage the cognitive demands of the school and move through the academic requirements. And intellectual engagement, which is where we activate that higher level of thinking about what we're using in the classroom. So students learn to analyze their own learning, think about their own learning, evaluate and synthesize what they're learning. All of those give learners opportunities to construct new knowledge and to solve complex problems. Those 3 levels of engagement can also be audited when we think about, is this child being served well in this particular environment? So let's talk about the study that I did. And so this is a mixed method study, as you'll see on the slide. And so I wanted to be able to capture the perspectives of multiple participants. So you'll see that we have the participants of deaf students, we have the perceptions of parents, the input of teachers, and the input of administrators, parents, and supervisors. So based on all of that input, we've also then been able to invite classroom assistants and interpreters to participate in the study. So there's multiple views on what does it mean to deal with a mediated education. Case study design, and so in-depth interviews with all of those participants, online surveys, and then videotaped interactions in the classroom. So we've been able to videotape interpreters working so that we can actually see what does the student experience through their eyes. That looks at what did the teacher teach that day, what did the interpreter do with that message, and what did the student receive. So we've been able to get that videotape material and then analyze it through a linguistic frame and through a pedagogical frame, looking at how teachers use purposeful language. You'll see the slide and you will be able to see that we've got most of the provinces from Canada participating, and that the data is robust. And so when any time that you deal with case study data, you've got volumes and volumes to be able to sift through. So what I'm saying is that this is not just one school, but it's many schools, and there are common patterns across all of the schools that we looked at. When I looked at the data, I was most interested in thinking about, as a teacher myself, how do I construct language learning environments? And typically we know that good teaching uses 6 particular frames of language use in the classroom, regardless of what content you're teaching. So all of you are asking good, higher order questions, metacognitive questions. All of you are using both scaffolding techniques in your language use, and you're using scaffolding techniques to link previous knowledge to new knowledge. Scaffolding techniques will be familiar to you. You're also using, probably unconsciously, ways of reconceptualizing knowledge for students. So when you say something in the classroom, you might say it 2 or 3 different ways, and in that way you reach all of the learners in your classroom. You also then respond to student questions, or when students respond to your questions and you see that they're not quite on the right track, you'll also reframe what you've said in order to bring them into your way of understanding the content. So reconceptualizing. Reciprocal teachings, again, peer-to-peer. So when you think about the kinds of lovely interactions that occur in your classroom, where you've got students answering questions, students teaching other students through the nature of their report backs, all kinds of ways that we're using peer teaching in an environment. I looked at that. I also wanted to see what kinds of feedback strategies occurred in a classroom, because again, I know that each and every one of us as teachers guide student learning through constructive feedback, through corrective feedback, and that feedback, even when it's not directed at me individually, but I hear another student getting feedback, may inspire me to answer the question next time. So that feedback process, that feedback loop, is a really important aspect of learning. And finally, I looked at sequencing. So I looked at how teachers unpacked what it is that they were teaching, how did they put that into small curriculum content packages, and how did they sequence their instructions, and then again what happened in the interpreting. So I chose those common discourse frames because those happen in every classroom in every day. What you'll see on the next slide provides you with some understanding of the overall findings. And so when I looked at whether the work was accurate and effective, you'll notice I didn't say equal, because the interpretation will never be equal, it will be different. It can be effective, it can be accurate, but it won't be equal. And I contrasted that with when it wasn't effective and it wasn't accurate. And the results are disturbing, because we have, I think, across the country, some competent interpreters, and even on the hands of our most competent interpreters, they are struggling to produce the discourse frames or the ways of using language that teachers are using. And so you'll see that in our data set, 88% of the metacognitive questions, for example, were not accurately interpreted. That's a disturbing feature, because it's the metacognitive questions that allow students to then think about what their own thinking is, and for them to be evaluating the knowledge in the classroom. And so we see that they're not effective because sometimes they're omitted based on the pace of the classroom. Sometimes they're omitted based on the content knowledge of the interpreter, lack of knowledge. Sometimes they're just not heard in the ways of using simultaneous interpreting. Sometimes they're framed in a different way that doesn't make them a higher order question. So some very disturbing patterns, and again, I could give another lecture just on that. But I want you to take away the idea that the interpretation is not always accurate or effective. The scaffolding, 14% of it, the time it was accurate. Reciprocal teaching, 11%. Reconceptualizing, 25%. Sequencing, 30% and feedback 15% of the time. All of those particular percentages point to some very real problems with dealing with a mediated interpreted education. And again, I want to emphasize that many of the interpreters in this study are very well trained, very competent interpreters, but the demands of working simultaneously, again, a whole other research aspect that you're probably unfamiliar with that points to what do we know about quality interpreting. And so the fact that sign language interpreters can deal with simultaneous interpretation, you're speaking English, they can be signing, there's no language interference, that simultaneous act lends itself to a much greater error rate across all domains, whether it's legal interpreting, educational interpreting, medical interpreting. So the results, I think, should again give us some more data to help us to understand the realities of an interpreted education, and for us to really think about then, are there some ways and strategies that interpreters and teachers can employ in a classroom that might make the interpreting more consistently available to the student. Because when you think about those percentages, what happens in all of those classrooms then is that the deaf student ultimately moves from an active participant to a passive participant, which means that basically they're watching the interpreter all day, but they're not actively engaged because they don't even know what the questioning frame was. They're not actively engaged because they don't know the scaffolding techniques, let alone the scaffolding content. That because of the feedback and direction being omitted often for deaf students, they're not getting the encouragement that they might need. So all of those features then create what we call the bystander syndrome for many deaf students. So it would appear that they're in the classroom, they're physically placed, it would appear that they have access, you can look over, see the interpreter working, it would appear that there's access, but it's an illusion of access in terms of what the deaf student's actually receiving. I'm going to leave it there, and again on each of the video segments, I've tried to give you some of the research. I've tried to give you some of the practical elements that I'd like you to look at as a school considering an interpreted education. And I've tried to give you some ways to think differently about working with an interpreter. So I'll leave it there. I'll take your questions via email if you have them, and I look forward to my conversations with you. Thank you.